And here we are at the First Mile Brewery in Fort Kent, probably one of the newest businesses that we have in Fort Kent, and certainly becoming one of the most popular businesses that we have. And here with me is
Travis Jandreau.
And Travis, are you part of the owner or an owner, or what's your relationship, I guess, to the business?
Yeah, I'm actually one of the 5 owners.
So there are 5 of you.
5 of us, yeah.
How did the business start?
Business started, I guess, actually all 5 of us do some kind of fermentation, and most of it would be beer. And I would say probably 3 of the 5 of us have been brewing nearly 10 years each.
I started at home. I actually started dabbling in winemaking, and then I learned shortly within a few months of making wine that all the equipment to make wine is basically the same equipment you need to make beer, minus the stock pot. So once I got the stock pot, I started making beer and stopped making wine. If you take the simplest form of making wine, which is buying a box, and the extract version of making beer, wine is actually easier because you just basically have to dump out the juice, add water, and then the yeast. Where beer, to make good beer, you really have to boil it for an hour. The best beer you would have to do a boil an hour and then chill it before you pitch your yeast and that. So beer is more involved, and maybe that's kind of why I ended up liking that, because I do have a background in the laboratory in microbiology. The more challenging it was, the more fun it was for me. Every home brewer at some point imagines actually starting his or her own brewery, but only a small percentage ever do. But there's probably more breweries now than ever, which I really think there is, because it's just everybody's loving craft beer. But maybe about 5 years ago, I heard a rumor in town that Dr. Laren really was going to start a brew club, not a brew club, but a brewery in here. And I guess maybe I was a little envious because he had beat me to it, but I guess deep down maybe I wasn't really ready to pull that trigger with a young family and such. But then I learned that he wasn't actually starting the brewery. He was dreaming of starting the brewery, but I think, you got to put all your ducks in a row before you do that. So he kind of started a brew club in this area, the brewery area here, which was just blank, no walls, just the restrooms and white on the walls. And we started a brew club, and we started with 15 guys, and one girl being Becky, Dr. Laren's wife. And so we started with 30-gallon pots, and which was the right size to make about 15 gallons of beer. So we'd brew once a month, and every member would get 1 gallon of beer. So we brewed for maybe, I would say, a little over a year we brewed, and maybe every time we brewed and had maybe a couple beers, the conversation would start about the brewery. And first we were just kicking tires and this and that, but as time went on, the conversations got a little deeper and a little heavier, and then we started, meeting, and then we started actually brewing recipes at home to see, is this something we think that people, we started gearing some of our recipes to try to sell them in a brewery someday. And I don't think there was one place that was a catalyst that said we're going to start a brewery. I think it was always the intention, but we just didn't know how to get there. But apparently if you put enough guys in a room with a couple beers, you get really smart. So we started we started investigating on the paperwork and things like that, and once we started the ball rolling, we really got going, because they say it can take 6 months to get the paperwork done, and we had most of our paperwork done in about 6 weeks. And the government had the Tax and Trade Bureau, which is one of the hardest to get approved by, had approved us in 6 weeks. So once we got that in 6 weeks, it was as fast as we could put up walls and brew beer. We got it open, and I think we did it in less than 6 months, we got this place open. So, yeah, it was the weekend of Thanksgiving, which was just this past Thanksgiving, 2017, and we did a soft opening by invitation only on Friday night, and we said if the beer came out of the tap and the walls didn't fall down, then we were gonna no holds barred on Saturday. So things went well on Friday with family and friends, and so on Saturday we just basically put it out there by social media that we were going to be open, and that was it. We were open. We do have regular hours. They are Wednesday through Friday, 3:30 to 9 p.m. and Saturday 3 to 9 p.m. And we currently aren't open on Sundays, but we do special events. Often, sometimes special events are on Sunday, or we'll do, if we can staff it, we'll actually do earlier in the day before opening hours. We're currently going to be doing one shortly that is a what would you call a husband and wife and friends baby shower. So we've done baby showers, and we've done work parties and things like that and if anybody's interested, we do that, reach out to us by Facebook. As far as buying beer, you have to be 21 to buy beer, and but what's really unique about the tasting room that the government allows is that you have two options. You can actually come and sit and drink a beer here, but you can also pay a $3 deposit on a growler and take beer to go. So that's one of the unique things that a tasting room can do that like a typical restaurant can't do, is we can actually sell it from the tap to go, and that the whole growler sales thing has been a huge success for us. And as far as age restriction being here, we like to say that we're family friendly. Kids are welcome, and if you're going to talk about what's legal, not legal, as long as a parent is with a legal guardian or parent, children can be here. We're actually talking about possibly bringing a kid's table with coloring books and things like that, because the environment that we're promoting is a family-oriented place. We even have Girl Scouts cookies being sold sometimes out here in front. So.
Right, it's a community type,
Yeah.
and that's what you're trying to promote.
Yeah, yeah. Any request will be reviewed, I guess.
Now, you mentioned growlers.
Growler is traditionally either some people would call what we sell a howler, so it's a half growler, but that's debatable. I guess it depends who you're talking to, but generally it's a glass bottle that is 32 to 64 ounces, and it's got a cap, a replaceable, removable cap, that you just fill it, you bring it in clean, you refill it, and you take it home and you drink. You can stick it in the fridge for a few days or maybe even a week and drink it at your leisure. So think of it as like a 2-liter bottle of soda when you're buying it in bulk. It's that version, but for beer. And of course the growler itself is dark brown because that shields the light so your beer doesn't spoil. It can't be any growler. It has to legally it has to have our growler. It has to have, our logo. It has to have the Surgeon General's warning, which is one of the most important things, and it has to have the volume written on it as well. Well, actually, we did meet last night, and I guess I can tell you some of what we talked about, but I'd like to break everything we do into phases. So phase 1 was basically opening and selling beer here in brewery. Phase 2 was the growler sales, because then we were selling beer to go, and that probably more than doubled our sales. So now we're brewing beer as fast as we can. Phase 3 would be distribution, and I wouldn't say we are distributing now, but I guess it would be in a limited capacity so we can get a feel for it. And right now we're just distributing to Lonesome Pine trails, and we like Lonesome Pines. Most of us, the partners, all ski there, or the kids ski, and we just like the culture. They have the mug club and they do special events, and they've actually allowed us to do tap takeovers, and there's some of their special events. So I guess what's next for the brewery is we're going to start to expand our ability to produce more beer, which will be we're only wanting to go as fast as we're comfortable with. We don't want to get a huge loan or anything like that. We're just looking to maybe get a small loan, go to the next size, and keep stepping it up like that. So we might start looking at distributing more to more areas, but we'd only be a few at a time, because our most important thing to us is always to have all 8 taps flowing, and we don't want to run out of beer here. So as far as food, you know, in the beginning when we opened, it was people were not used to not having food available, but we tell people, you want us to make beer for you, but you probably don't want to eat the food that we would cook. But that was kind of a joke, because we are actually pretty decent cooks. But as far as food, what we've done is, instead of making our own food, we've decided that there are some restaurants in town making such good food. Why would we compete with them when we can actually join forces? So at this time, 3 of their local restaurants have brought menus here. And there was one next door, so it's easy to order and receive your food. One of the restaurants was already doing delivery, and one of the other restaurants actually wasn't doing delivery, but came here with a special menu from the restaurant, said they could get food out in a timely fashion, and they were going to deliver to First Mile Brewing only. So I believe that is just it's a good thing for the community. Instead of trying to do something that everybody else is doing, it's just to partner up and still have that service for people to eat here, and that's been a huge success. People have actually really enjoyed that. So. Right now, this is where our logo is, that people like to take photos, and what you're looking at right now is one of the 3 standing tables. So these are the higher ones for standing, because I'm not sitting, I'm actually standing. But we've had some requests, you know, for larger groups to come in. So what we're going to probably do, one of the things we discussed last night, is get some higher bar stools. So if you had a group of 8 or 12 people and you wanted to sit all together, those tables that last, we'll go over those tables, maximum would be about 6 people. So if you came in with 8 to 12 people, we could probably join these standing tables if they were available, and pull out the bar stools and sit. But these started off as standing tables. So
here we have a different type of table.
Yeah, here we have the sitting tables. We got 5 of these. These were actually made by one of our partners. So actually, one of the partners did the woodworking, and he did a really impressive job. And our brewer, he actually built the brackets for it. So we have a woodworker and a welder, and we're a pretty well-rounded crew, I guess you could say.
Like you're a real group of talented people.
A multifaceted group, I guess, is what the term is. So we've got the shorter bar stools in this sitting area by the window, and we've got free Wi-Fi, so if you ever want to come in, do some work or whatever like that, we do have people come in, sometimes just sit with their laptops and do their own thing. We do have some games. We've got cribbage and Mancala and some cards if people ever want to come in.
And this is our bar area.
This is the bar area. Yep. Not really much more I can say than the bar area. So we've got an area sitting around it, and then in the back we got the 8 taps. If you want to get maybe a closer look at that, we'll zoom in here in a bit. But
now, one thing that I notice as I'm looking around the room, a lot of things are, I wouldn't say antiques, but they're vintage articles. The cash register is an obvious one.
Actually, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. All of the vintage things you see down here were actually taken out of the basement of the brewery. The cash register actually used to be used here, probably back in the day when it was the ADCC IGA, and even the farmer's market, you know, that the mat, everything you see basically the signs on the wall over here, we'll see in a bit, that all came out of the basement. So nothing was taken, we didn't go out shopping for anything, we actually just took things out of, actually, I should mention that all of this wood on the bottom of the bar and the background here in this wall actually was taken out of the basement as well. And when I said it was an old grain house, this was these were the walls and the floor of the grain. So that's why you have that weathered, and if you actually ever touched it, it's got a little bit of an oily character from it, and that probably came from the grain as well. So.
Now I noticed the A.D. Susie sign that stands at the top, and the IGA store. I'm assuming these are original as well.
These are original, yeah. Yeah, this one I believe was found a little bit later. It was kind of, I don't know if it was hidden within a wall or behind a wall, so it was only found recently, and it actually couldn't come up from our stairs. We actually had to bring it all the way down into the next building that's connected and through a stairway up there so we could get it up. So we like to incorporate a lot of the history of the building into to what we're doing now, because it kind of fits with the rustic industrial look we have, and as well as the gas, which we'd all love for gas to be that price, but
we don't see that anymore.
We don't see that anymore. And then even that Valvoline sign was probably back at some point when, well, I don't know, maybe they sold at the grocery store. I don't know if this was ever a gas station here, but it was, yeah, I guess it was. So.
But now we're here in the grain cellar, and Travis, what do we have here?
Yeah, so over here we have all the grain, and this is where we, I guess you could say we start our day here. We actually start heating the water, but really the work starts here where we come down here to grind the grain, weigh them out, and grind them. And grain can be broken up in probably about 4 categories. And those categories would be base malt, which is the majority of the grain, which gives it most of the sugars that the yeast will be breaking down into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Base malts usually are broken up in either to 2-row, 6-row, Pilsner malts, things like that. And some beers are made completely with just base malt, and others, base malt is the majority of it, and then we add a lot of other malts to give it flavor, color, things like that. So we got the base malt, we have the toasted malts, which can be as dark as coffee grains, or I guess we could break up the toasted malts into maybe 2 categories. I guess when I say 4 categories, those would be 2 of the categories. Are toasted malts, you have this range of really dark ones, and then you have this other category within that category is caramel or crystal malt, which a lot of beers have caramel or crystal malt, and that gives it a little extra sweetness and a little bit of depth of flavor. And then, so those two are the 4 categories. And then we have things like adjunct, which would be oatmeal and wheat and things like that.
So those, now you get these grains, they're really grains at the time, and then you have to grind them up.
Yep. So if you take a little closer look, these are grains that haven't been ground yet. And this is a base malt, so it's very light. And this base malt actually there's a little more to it. This actually doesn't come out of the field ready to roll. This actually has to be malted. And what happens is, if you just took grain out of a field, you would never be able to extract the sugars, because the sugars are just too complex. They're actually really hidden in this kernel. So what you got to do to malt it is, they do it in modern instruments now with rollers and drums and things like that, moisture. But in the old days, they would have actually done it right in a building like this called floor malting. So what you would do is you would spread out the malt in maybe 8 to 12 inches, and you would actually wet it, and you'd keep the right temperature. And what you're actually trying to do is fool this into thinking it's time to sprout and grow in a field. So once you see just a little bit of green coming out where it's about to sprout, you've known that it's actually ready to share the sugar, because it's giving the sugar to the plant. So at that point, what they would do is they would turn on these heaters and start floor malting them again and dry it all out to stop it at that stage. Now what you've got in this kernel is a sugar that you can get to, and the enzymes in here, but the sugar is actually still not usable because it's a long starch. What you have in here is also an enzyme. So later we'll talk about upstairs what Matt's doing right now. He's mashing, and I'll explain what the mash does with the sugar and the enzymes and those starches. But this is unground, and then we take it through here, which is our grinder. There's 2 rollers in here with this motor that just basically turns these 2 wheels, pulls the grain through and crushes it. And that grain, you've seen the full kernel, and when it's ground, it's just basically a powder.
Wow.
So it's very small, and it crushes all of it, and even the husks that are in there as well, but those come apart pretty much as well.
So this will become kind of the mash for the whole brewing.
Yeah, this is the mash is made with, it's basically water at a certain temperature, and what you just saw in my hand here is that crushed grain.
Now, how does each type of malt or grain produce a different kind of beer?
Yeah, each one will impart a different flavor and character of the beer. So the base malt generally adds very little to the beer. The base malt makes a neutral beer, but some of them, if you have a really, really, really light beer with no other additives, like a Pilsner, that beer alone, you'll be able to taste the Pilsner, that character of the Pilsner. But as we add things like, obviously, like this dark grain, certain chocolate, what we call them chocolate, will impart chocolates, but some of them are roasted so dark, if you could smell through the camera right now, you would actually be smelling coffee. And if you've ever tried our Harry Porter, you'll know what I'm talking about, because that coffee flavor, some people think it's a coffee porter, but that one has no coffee in it. It's all from the grain. And we got all kinds of things. We've got even, and so I'd say this is actually not just grain. We actually have some coriander seed, which this is it's actually, you've probably seen this in your kitchen. Is coriander is a ground spice, and this is one of the components that we add to our Belgian wit called something witty. So we do have some of the spices down here as well.
So when you actually decide on making a batch of beer, certain flavor, you really have to order the right malts and the right grains to have them ready so that you can produce your beer.
We do, yeah. It's inventory management. We have to be very careful. Luckily there's 5 partners, so each one of us has certain responsibilities. So we can, each person can focus on his responsibilities and do them well. And because we have 8 taps, but we have about 25 recipes. So if you can think about the logistics of maybe somewhere of 6 to 12 ingredients for each beer, at 25 recipes, there's quite a bit of logistics.
That's a lot.
That out. And you can see that we used to have all of our grains on the floor piled on pallets, but our carpenter was really great, and he took some of the old shelving here, and we're a little more organized now. So the grinding happens here on this unit, and then we weigh out on this little scale and over here. So.
Is it hard to get the malts, the grains? I mean, there's so many grains here. Are they readily available?
The grains are actually readily available. I don't think we've ever tried to order a grain that we could not get at this time. We just to make sure we do order in bulk, and it comes in on a pallet. And about 2,000 pounds is usually what we get at a time. So we try to stay ahead, but we've run out, and we've had to either improvise or like we were part of this this invitation only Facebook group for brewers, because we're part of the Maine Brewers Guild, and we don't have anybody that's quite close enough that we can run down the road to, but I know like downstate they're really good. It says, hey, anybody have 50 pounds of Belgian Pilsner malt? we'll either buy it or we'll replace it when ours comes in. It'll be in the end of the week, because when you have a storm, today it's storming. Sometimes when you have a storm, shipments get delayed and things like that, and you have to be ready to adjust. Sometimes when we don't get it on time, we'll just brew a different batch at that day. So.
Well, this is great. Now I guess we'll see the next step of the process.
Okay.
We've just ground the grain, and we're back upstairs, and this looks like a chemistry lab. A beaker of liquid and several cups, and tell me what this is all about.
So when you're making beer, there's basically 4 main ingredients. There's oftentimes can be more, but for the most part, these are the 4. It's water, grain, hops, and yeast. The biggest part of beer is actually water, and we'll probably get into. I'll break each video segment. We'll cover a little bit of this. So, like I said, water is the biggest part of beer. This is where the sugars come from, and if you didn't have hops, beer would taste abnormally sweet without any balance. So that's where the hops come in, and of course the yeast. Back in many years ago, they didn't actually know yeast existed, but now we do, so we actually cultivate it. But in the old days, each area actually had a mash paddle that was very sacred, because they didn't understand what made the beer, but they knew when they took that mash paddle and stirred everything up, for some reason the beer, that wort is actually the word that we call the liquid that comes out of the final boil kettle. It's wort, and then after the yeast does its part, then it becomes beer.
So this is the kitchen area.
This is the brewery, yeah, the brewery, which is like a kitchen area, but
it's a lot of stainless steel, very clean, big pots. Could you tell us what all of this is?
So this is where all the magic happens. So we, as you'll see at one point, we grind the grains, and that's one of the components of beer. The next step would be the water. That's one of the largest, biggest percentage of ingredient is water. And of course, we are on town water, but we use this special filter. It doesn't look like much, but it actually strips the water down to nothing. So what we come out with is the most ultra soft water you can really use in brewing. And this is our brewer, Matt. He doesn't like to say much for the camera, but he'll be working in the background because we're actually brewing beer right now as we speak. So when you talk about water, in some areas, soft water is the best, and in some areas, like when you're talking like in Ireland with Guinness, that's really hard water. So the nice thing about having ultra soft water is that we have our water is a blank palate. So sometimes we use soft water, but sometimes we do have to harden it up. And if you look at here, you'll see these are all brewing salts. So if we need to harden things up, we've got calcium chloride, magnesium sulfate, calcium sulfate, and it depends what we want to do. Some of them, like calcium sulfate will actually enhance the crispness of the hops, where calcium chloride just makes a better, more desirable pH for the mash, which we'll talk about the mash, and some of it gives it mouthfeel. So those salts are they're food grade salts. They're actually duplicating what naturally occurs in nature in that water, which we've already stripped out of it. So brewing is mostly chemistry. There is some art, some science, and a little bit of something we can't tell you because we have to hide some of our trade secrets. But those ions, when you take those white salts, those are naturally what would come out of rocks. When you put them in water, they dissolve into ions, and they cause chemical reactions that make you can make the malt come out more, you can make, but these are salts that naturally dissolve out of rock, out of underwater aquifers and things like that.
here we're mixing the grains with the water. This is the water in here is called the strike water, which is one of the stages, and we're mixing the grain with it for the 60-minute mash.
So the water is at a certain temperature right now?
Yeah, it's somewhere probably around 165 to 168 degrees, because the grain itself is probably only 65 degrees. But in the end, what will happen is it'll settle out to about maybe 152 degrees.
So this is what's gonna kind of separate, I wouldn't say separate, but activate the sugars.
Correct. The enzymes will break the starches into more simple sugars, or shorter chain carbohydrates. And the temperature is really important, because if you mash at 156 degrees instead, those sugars would actually be less fermentable. There'd actually be longer chains. So your yeast would not be able to eat all the sugars. Your beer would end up a little sweeter. But if, on the other end, if you mash at 148 or 146 degrees, your enzymes will actually break your carbohydrates into shorter chains, and in the end, the yeast will eat more of the sugars, and you'll end up with a drier beer. So you have control at many different levels of the brewing process that change the taste and the character of the final product.
Now in this one, which one are we brewing today? Which one are you mixing? What's the name of this beer?
Matt, what's the name of this beer?
So the Farmer Brown Ale.
The Farmer Brown Ale.
A tribute to the farmers. And you see the first bucket was a lighter grain. That was all base malt, but now we're starting to see some of those toasted malts we talked about in the basement. And if you could, like you said, if you could smell through the camera, it smells like coffee right now. It's great. This beer will probably be, people will probably like this beer a lot. It'll be a bit like the Backwoods Amber Ale, where it'll be reminiscent of coffee and chocolate, but a little sweet maybe as well. There's a secret ingredient in this one as well, just can't tell you, but it's going to be good. It has that ingredient in common with the Backwoods Amber Ale.
So when will this one be available for people to purchase?
What do you think?
Let's say second week of April.
Second week in April.
2.5 to 3 weeks before we'll get it out on tap.
Now you can see a different. This has got oats in it, a little bit of oats. What oats does, might keep it a little cloudy, but the desired oats often is what we would describe as a silky mouthfeel. When you drink it, it has that really nice soft feeling in your mouth. Hard to describe, but if you hear me say silky mouthfeel and then you try it, you know exactly what we're talking about.
So really, there are a lot of ingredients but there again, it depends on the beer that you're making, the recipe, I should say.
Yeah, it depends what. And this was these are bigger pails, but generally most beers are about 4 of the 5-gallon pails, but these are 7-gallon pails. But our biggest beer of the first snow, because it's 8.2%, is a 5-pail batch. That's our biggest one, so helps keep us in shape, a little bit after. Or Matt does some of the running. Once in a while, I come in to help.
Now, that's the amount of alcohol that ends up in the beer. Is it proportionate to the amount of grain that you put in?
For the most part, yeah. It depends which grains you put as well. Some have more sugars than other, or sugar potential. And some beers, if you want to keep them light, but have a higher alcohol by volume, we'll add things like sugars or even Belgian beers. A lot of Belgian beers use what they call Belgian candy syrup, which is a syrup that comes from beets and I forget what they try, but it's actually natural. All the sugars we use come from, well, naturally from plants, but it's usually either dates, corn. We don't use any high fructose corn syrup, but some of the corn sugar is natural corn sugar is very clear, so if you add it to the beer, it imparts no flavor, but it'll increase the alcohol. So if you want to make like a light summer beer with minimum ingredients, you add a little sugar to keep it light. So at this point, we have hot water in that tank. We're mashing in with our second batch here, and our first batch is actually boiling. So we got 2 batches going on right now. And that'll be it for today, 2 batches, but if there was 2 of us here and we wanted to do, well, even probably one of us could get away with it if you're really good. You could have all of this going right now, desirably with one other guy watching, but you could be in the basement grinding grain for the 3rd batch. So it's
very step-by-step cookbook process.
Step-by-step, but it's like cooking a 5-course meal for a group of 8 people. Like it is. So it is step-by-step, but you're multitasking to the max, because you also have to be moving beer out of these fermenters to get ready to move these beers into. So, but that's lots of practice now.
We've had 45 Farmer Browns are 46 batch.
46 barrels of beer we've made so far. So.
Wow.
Which sounds like a lot, but if you compare it to a large brewery, they would make that maybe in like half a day or 1 batch. So it all depends, your scale.
This is what we would call the brew house. This is the brewery, but we tend to call that a brew house or a brew system because ours is a bit smaller. Ours is a 1-barrel system, so these are actually 50 gallons. So 1 barrel, they make 31 gallons finished product, but you need a lot more space to handle all the liquids because you're mixing other things in there as well. And we take pride in that we ordered these, but our brewer, when he's not brewing, is actually a welder, and he actually TIG welded all of these fittings in here. So this whole system and this whole setup here are actually made by us, And like I said, it's a 1-barrel system. 1 barrel of beer is 31 gallons. So when you see a large keg, which you probably saw in the background earlier, one of the large kegs is 15.5 gallons. So that's a half-barrel keg. So when we make a batch, we make 1 barrel, which fills 2 of those large kegs. But in the future, and right now that's the capacity of those fermenters, but in the future we'll probably be getting 2 or 3 barrel fermenters and brewing back-to-back sessions of the same beer.
Okay, so rather than get a bigger container, you'd go with multiple, same size, but more of one.
Yeah, we really like our system right now, and we don't want to grow here yet. We're probably going to grow on the fermenter side, so we can brew multiple batches and fill. So instead of brewing one, right now we're doing a new beer called Farmer Brown, actually, which is a new brown ale. Instead of doing one barrel of Farmer Brown ale and putting it in a fermenter, Matt would probably do like 2 or 3 rounds of this and fill that to the top. So we'd be increasing our capacity. So our flagship beers, I guess you would call them, would probably go into the larger fermenter. So when we start here, this is the HLT. HLT stands for hot liquor tank. tank. All that happens here for the most part is water is heated. When we go into this pot, this is the mash tun. And so when you've seen earlier when we ground the grain, we are taking that grain, we are putting it with a water at a certain temperature. Normally we want to rest the water and the grain at a temperature of about 152 degrees. And when we were talking earlier about starch and enzymes, that is what you're trying to do. You're causing a chemical reaction here. Is that instead of a simple sugar that yeast can actually break down, this is a long starch. Yeast can't handle it when it comes up ground up as a powder like this. So when you mix this grain that's ground fine with water that settles at 152 degrees, what you're doing is you're activating an enzyme in there, the natural enzyme in that kernel that will break those starches down to simple sugar that yeast can actually break. We can probably extract nutrients from this because we have enzymes in our stomach, but the yeast need us to do it for them, and that's what we're doing here. So this beer will rest at about 150 degrees for an hour. So the conversion usually takes about 45 minutes, but sometimes can take a little longer. So the traditional time is about 60 minutes. Certain beers, we actually take that to 90 minutes.
So really the ingredients are just in there for that period of time, that one container?
Yep, that's correct. Yep, so about an hour here. Well, an hour of mashing, and then what happens, we go through a rinsing cycle. So the bottom of this has what we call a false bottom. So it sits a couple inches off the bottom. It's got a bunch of little holes in it. So conveniently, all that grain in there that's mashing actually becomes a filter. So what we do is we start pumping water from the hot water liquor tank, the HLT, we pull it in and we sprinkle it through this device. It's got a bunch of holes in it. So the water comes in through here, sprinkles down because you want to get a nice even shower, and it washes all of that, not just the sugars, but all the water that's in there, the sugars, the colors, all the flavor compounds get pushed through that grain bed. The grain bed compacts and it creates a filter. So what we do is we actually run it back, we circle it back first so it compacts, and once it clears up, then we take it over to this pot, which is called the boil kettle. And then this whole system is electric. Most home brewers, we do propane, but we did make an electric system because we didn't want all the electric tends to be safer. You're not creating all those fumes in here. Even though propane's clean, we want to be safer. So basically, if you think about what your oven looks like at home, you have that coil in that heats. We have coils in the bottom of here. So once we wash all of that flavor and sugar and all of that good stuff to the boil kettle, then we bring it to a boil and we boil it for an hour. Normally an hour, sometimes a little longer. And at this point in the boil is where we might add what we talked about would be the brewing salts to make it harder, so you get it adds character to the beer. We would also add the hops. We would add yeast nutrient, so that goes into solution. So when we add yeast later, the yeast is fine eating the sugar here, but it's like anything else. Like you and I, we eat well, but we take our multivitamins, just make sure we get everything we need. That's like a multivitamin for yeast. And we also put something called whirlflock or Irish moss, which is a powder that will actually bind certain proteins. So later on, when we cool it, it'll actually make clearer beer. Some beers we want to be cloudy, so we don't add that whirlflock that drops it clean. So once it boils and we add, and all those additions have to go in a special time. So we do that, and or go ahead if you have any questions at this one.
So really, this process we're probably talking about 3 hours total. If you think of the draining and this is a 3-hour process.
Pretty good math there, Don. Yeah, about 3 hours.
3 hours.
Yeah, the whole brew day will be about 6 hours. So So at this time, we've learned that it's better, instead of coming in and brewing two batches on different days, it's sometimes better to go back to back, because in this case, we have one going already. When you're boiling one, you can be ready to go with the next one, and that's where we're at right now. And you only have to clean up once, which is way the bonus, you know. So after it's done boiling and we've added all our components here, actually, these two things are the pumps down here. This is how we move all our liquid, because at home we're picking up big vessels, but if you do the math of 31 gallons times about 8 pounds per gallon roughly, we're probably not going to be picking these up. So we end up pumping this through a wort chiller, which is right under here, and it might be a little hard to see. So what happens here is you have a copper line within a copper line. So you're actually pushing beer through one copper line, and on the outside of that, in the opposite direction, is cold water. So someday we'll probably have to upgrade that, because it is difficult to chill a large amount of beer through something of that degree, that size, but that equipment there's not a lot of in between for these smaller breweries. It's usually you're a home brewer or you're a brewery, and this is quite a small brewery on this. For us as a home brewers, we thought this was a big system, but when you get into some of the other breweries, these vessels are this tall and that big around. So we're not ready to buy that equipment at that level yet, but in the next phase maybe so. And the black box at the end is the control box. So that's how we turn on the elements that heat in the pumps. And so at that point, when the beer is chilled, once it's chilled, at this point, it's, like I said, it's called wort. It's not beer yet, it's wort. Wort is W-O-R-T. So that just means that there's no alcohol, but there's a lot of sugar. So at that point, if you drank it, it would just taste really sweet, and it would be flat and warm and not carbonated, so it wouldn't be very good. And you wouldn't make you feel as happy as the final product. So once the beer goes through the wort chiller, it gets pumped into one of our fermenters, which we list on the wall as FVs, fermentation vessels. These ones are 55 gallons, and we make one barrel, so we tend to have them, anywhere from 31 to 35 gallons is our final product right now. But you can tell when it ferments, you can see that it's actually fermented way up here. So you always want to have a headspace. We have quite a bit of headspace, but that's okay, because when it produces, you don't want to ever have your beer exposed to oxygen, because oxygen will give your beer bad flavor. But the good thing is that when yeast breaks down the beer, those sugars and alcohol, it releases CO2, which creates that protective blanket. So at this point, once we pump in the beer, the wort, and it cools down, we bring the yeast, which we showed a while ago, and we ended up dumping that in here. And I forgot one little step, is that when we're transferring the yeast, when we're transferring the wort from over there, we actually have an oxygen tank with an inline system. So when the wort's going across, we're actually injecting oxygen into that wort, because that is just a very small amount of yeast, and the yeast goes through an exponential growth phase, and some of the things that we need are in that yeast nutrient we talked about, but it also needs some oxygen as well to do that. So we pump it in with oxygen, we add the yeast in the top, and once that happens, we have, over here we have this control panel, and some pumps to pump cold water through a coil. So at this point, it's very, very important to keep your fermenting beer at the right temperature. So fermentation control is very important. So ideally, most beers will stay in here 10 days would be good. I'd say 10 to 14 days, but right now we find 10 days works well. You don't want to move it too fast, but if you have the time, you'll go through fermentation in about 5 to 7 days, and then there's next few days it just cleans itself up. And once it's really done, we take a sample out of here in this port, and we use, we pour a sample in here, and then we use this little hydrometer, and we drop it in here, and we can actually, we take a reading in the beginning, and then we take a reading in the end, and we know what it should finish at through experience. We know that if it's going to finish at, say, 1014, we call it, which would be 1.014. Once it hits 1014, we know it's done. Then we drop that temperature to cool it. When you cool it, a lot of the cloudiness will drop out of it. We ferment, when it's actually actively fermenting, we try to control it maybe somewhere in the 65 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit is fermentation. And then when we drop it cool, the cooler is better. You know, if you can take it down to 35 or 36 degrees, that is ideal. Our system can't do that, but we're going to be upgrading soon, and then we'll probably be able to do that. But right now, our system, we can take it down to about 50 degrees. So, and that works well for us. But by maybe going with glycol, like we're using a homemade refrigeration, or not refrigeration, but our homemade cooling unit right now that really worked well. Kind of, Matt and I kind of had this idea, and it worked kind of well to bide us some time. But glycol is it's like a refrigeration unit. Once we can have glycol cooling our thing in there, once we pump the water through those coils, we'll be able to drop this down to probably 36 degrees.
Now you've got 4 tanks at the moment.
Yep.
4 fermenters. So each one has a certain type of beer right now.
Yeah. Each one has a different beer, and we keep these charts on here so we can monitor, know which one's in which, and actually monitor every time. Like I said, we take a sample and we test it. Any special notes we write right on that paper, and we keep those for our records, so we can always look back and say, can compare notes to last batches and things like that. So we started. These are NSF certified HDPE. I forget that type of plastic, which is food grade plastic. But our dream was always to go stainless steel. So we'll be ordering new fermenters soon, larger stainless steel, and I guess that will be our. To ramp up production so we can start to get right now we're at max capacity. We're barely keeping up, so we are having to hold back, I guess, the brewery. The sky's the limit at this point, so in the future you'll see, if you come here to the brewery, you'll probably see about the same width, maybe a little wider stainless steel fermenters that will be a bit higher like that. So.
And I'm assuming if you're going to make 2 batches back to back of one beer, you probably want to put your 2 batches in one container.
Yep. So right now, when we do 2 batches back to back, there tend to be 2 different ones. So it takes a lot of coordination for a brewer to actually try to bring 2, to have 2 empty fermenters. It's very tricky to do that. But like you said, if it's 2, maybe even 3 barrels, he may do a 2, maybe even 3 batches back to back, but they will all be the same beer, and we'll pump it into the bigger one. So the beers that sell the most will probably be going to the larger one like that, and then on other days, the specialty beers that are either seasonal or move a little slower but have a good following, then on that day he might brew 2 different ones to go into these.
So once this process is done and the beer is ready, you've tested it, what's the next step?
Yep, so at that time we have taken wort and we've made beer. This beer is not cool enough, and it's flat, and it's still got some protein and undesirable yeast floating in there. So the next step would be this little guy right here, which is called a bright tank. So this would be in the cooler, and at that time we would pump the beer from the fermenter into the bright tank, and we would have to let it sit overnight to actually reach 36 degrees. That's about our temperature in there. And to get the carbonation level you want, it's another science chemistry thing where there's a chart. So if you want a certain amount of carbonation, it's dependent on temperature, because the cooler the beer is, the more CO2 it will absorb. So you have to we have to get the beer down to 36 degrees, and then we hook up the CO2 tank to it, and then we carbonate it. And the reason that these vessels, and like I said, when you see our new fermenters, they'll be slim and tall. That is desirable for fermentation, but if you notice, this guy is a little bit wider and shorter, and that's on purpose as well, because like I said, when the temperature cools, proteins and yeast start to drop out of it, and if it has to travel less distance, the quicker that your beer will finish. So that's why this tank is shaped this shape, with those cones make things drop out quicker, and this one's a little bit domed. So when they call bright, you're basically making, I guess you could say, brighter beer, clearer beer. So once it sits overnight, it gets to 36 degrees, we have to keep it on CO2 for about 48 hours, which is longer than we like to, but that's what we're finding the capability of this is. So our new fermenters might be a dual purpose fermenter, where we may actually be able to open the valve. We'd actually cool in the fermenter, and all that stuff would drop off. We'd empty it, and then we carbonate in that new, it's called a uni tank. So it can ferment and bright, but the brightest beer usually goes right through a bright tank. And so once it sits here for 48 hours and it's carbonated, we'll take a sample, make sure that it tastes right, carbonation's right, then we pump it into a keg directly from there, in those big stainless steel kegs, which are half barrel each. And once it's in that keg, that's it. It's the final product. You've got finished beer that's cold, it's carbonated, it's cleared, and at any time it can be tapped and ready to go. So usually by the time it gets in the keg, it's only a matter of days, less than a week, before it's up on tap. So it's very fresh beer we're coming out of our taps.
So how long would a beer actually stay in a keg? Once because I'm assuming this is all sealed.
Yeah, it's all sealed. Beer, I guess, would be like wine. Is wine you can age wine for years, but if you were going to go buy a bottle of wine at a grocery store, it's not, you have to put it on a shelf to sell it, but the best way to store things are cool, cold, out of light, and don't move it. And if the keg's in the fridge and it's not moving around, it could last months, 4 to 6 months, I would say, would be possible. So from beginning to end, from the grain to the keg, it takes about, we'll say 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks from grain to keg, or grain to glass, as we say. But like I said, if you wanted, beer, the ideal way to store beer would be in a keg, because it's protected from light. Beer bottles are brown to protect the light, but there is still some stray light that gets to it. In a keg, you've got that inert metal, it's cold, so it can last quite a while. And we have the half barrel, sorry I keep saying that, the half barrel 15.5 kegs, but we also have the 6 gallons, as that's what traditionally we're sending to Lonesome Pine Trails, are those 6-tels or 6-lits, whatever you call them. So they look more like a soda keg, but instead of having the 2 taps, we have the Sankey tap that goes in the middle. So our batch will, we'd make 1 barrel batches, which I said, and 1 barrel batch will fill 2 of these, but since these are 6 gallons each, we'll fill about 6 of them. Maybe about 5 of them. I think we'll do about 5 to 6, depending on how much we got in the fermentation vessel. Each beer tends to make a little bit of a different final product, so that depends, because our bright tank can handle way more than 30 wine gallons, so if we get 30 wine gallons, we may get 5 of those. If we get 33 or 34 gallons, we may get an extra one in there, so.
Now, Travis, we've gone through the kitchen, we've gone through the tanks. How many different kinds of beers do you produce? I mean, first of all, each batch takes quite a long process, and there's a lot of coordination here. Never mind the science that goes along with it, but this is a lot of coordination here, especially if some flavors of beer go faster than others. You really have to coordinate your batches.
Yeah, we do, yeah.
How many different kinds of beer do you currently have?
Well, we've got, like I said, we've got 8 taps. So at any given time, we'll have 8 beers. And 7 of those taps are CO2, one's nitro. But we actually have now maybe a little over 25 recipes, but that definitely is not the end, because we're always dreaming up new recipes. And if if we go to, we were at Eureka Hall the other day, because there was a great band there, and we tried, they have a nice range of different beers, and you try different beers somewhere, you get inspired. So we're always dreaming up. I guess we sometimes have visions in our sleep of the next beer we're going to make, so we're always wanting to, we know that we'll always have certain customers that will follow their favorite beer, but myself, I have my favorites, but I'm always looking to try something new, and we definitely have a group of people who always want to try what's new, and we always want to keep new things coming. So, plus it helps us learn about brewing different kinds of beer. So,
well, it sounds with all these different materials, the grains, the salts, the processes itself, the temperatures, you can really come up with a variety, more than 25 different beers, or different types and qualities of beer.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you can take the beer we're making right now, that Farmer Brown Ale, and use all the same ingredients, just change the ratios of those ingredients. Or what might even be even more surprising is that if you just change the yeast, the yeast itself will change it. But forget even changing the yeast. Use the same ingredients in the same proportions with the same yeast, and change that fermentation in the vessel by 5 degrees, you're going to have a different beer, because the temperature that the yeast ferments at can change and that's why if you're going to be a home brewer, we always want the nicest stock pot and this and that, but really if you can learn fermentation, temperature control, that is really one of the biggest components to clear, consistent beer.
Travis, I can't thank you enough.
Well, thank you.
This is great. This new business in Fort Kent, but certainly this whole process, that it really is very technical, very chemistry oriented, and from all we see here, everything is so clean and spotless on stainless steel. Sanitation is a big part of this. But it's more of the business that you're providing people. Although, I have to ask one more question. What's in Fort Kent? What's your most popular beer?
It is something witty, which is a Belgian wit. That is definitely our biggest seller, but surprisingly, the beer that's right on its heels is a First Snow Double IPA. And most people think double IPA, it is a strong beer, it's 8.2% right now. And people are usually scared off by IPAs, because the old days, when we got an IPA, it was a West Coast IPA. And West The West Coast, they put all their hops in the beginning, and they go big and bold, and it's, you know, it's like, it seems like it may eat the enamel off your teeth kind of beer. People around here don't like that beer. However, the new emergence is the New England style IPA. And that's taken, no surprise, New England by storm. There's actually a brewery in Portland, I think they make mostly just that kind of beer. That is our number 2 seller, and people are loving it because we add all our hops in the end, and it makes a very, it tastes like grapefruit, and people actually think there's grapefruit in it, but that's actually all from a special premium hop that we add a bunch at the end, and people love that beer, and when they think that they won't, we give them a little sample, and it always catches people by surprise. And that is one of the most rewarding things, is to expand somebody's horizon in beer drinking, and just say, you know, have them try flavors outside of their normal comfort zone. And we've even had people come in. Another popular one, it's not our most popular one, but it's an interesting one I'd like to mention, is our Backwoods Amber Ale. We called it Backwoods Autumn Ale. We were going to make it just a seasonal beer, but it was such a hit that now we brew it every once in a while. We call it Amber Ale now. There's people have told us that I don't like dark beer, and now that I've tried this beer, I not only like dark beer, it's my favorite beer. You know, so that is one of the most fun challenges here, is people come in asking for light beer, but often when they leave,
You've changed their mind.
they change their minds, and the flight glass is how most people get those introductions. So.